November 13th, 2017. A Monday afternoon in the joint security area at Panmunjom, the only place where North and South Korea directly face each other without physical barriers. A military vehicle approached from the North Korean side, a Soviet-era jeep driving along the single-lane road that leads through the carefully monitored neutral zone. The vehicle was moving faster than normal. North Korean guards at the checkpoint noticed something unusual. The driver was not slowing down. The jeep accelerated toward the border. Inside the vehicle was Oh Chong-song, a 24-year-old soldier in the Korean People's Army. He was a junior officer assigned to guard duty at the Joint Security Area, one of the most sensitive postings in North Korea. Soldiers selected for a GSA duty were chosen for their loyalty, their family backgrounds, their physical fitness. They underwent extensive political indoctrination and were watched constantly by security officers to ensure no one harbored thoughts of defection. Oh Chong-song had passed all those screenings. He was considered reliable, trusted, a good soldier from a respectable family. His father was a military general. His background was privileged by North Korean standards. But on this November afternoon, Oh had made a decision that would change his life and create international headlines. He was going to defect. He was going to drive his military vehicle across the border into South Korea and request asylum. He knew the risks. He knew that North Korean soldiers would shoot at him. He knew he might die. But he also knew he could not continue living in North Korea, could not continue serving a system he no longer believed in, could not accept the future that awaited him if he stayed. He pushed the accelerator to the floor. The jeep sped toward the military demarcation line that marked the border between North and South. North Korean guards realized what was happening and opened fire. Bullets struck the vehicle. Oh kept driving. The jeep crossed into South Korean territory but then became stuck in a ditch. Oh kicked open the door and ran. He was 55 meters south of the border, technically safe, but North Korean soldiers were pursuing and still shooting. Bullets hit him. One struck his shoulder, another hit his abdomen, a third pierced his elbow. He fell to the ground, bleeding heavily, unable to continue. For 40 minutes, Oh lay wounded in the dirt while South Korean and American soldiers debated how to rescue him without triggering a firefight. The area was under constant surveillance from both sides. North Korean soldiers had violated protocol by crossing the border while pursuing Oh. South Korean forces could not risk an escalation. Finally, under cover of darkness, South Korean soldiers crawled toward Oh's position, grabbed him, and dragged him to safety. He was unconscious, had lost massive amounts of blood, and was within minutes of death. Oh was rushed by helicopter to Aju University Hospital near Seoul. Trauma surgeon Lee Cook-jong, one of South Korea's most experienced emergency doctors, took charge. When Lee opened Oh's abdomen to stop the internal bleeding, he was shocked by what he found. Oh had been shot 5 times, not 3. The bullets had caused catastrophic damage to his intestines and other organs. But what stunned Lee even more were the parasites. Oh's intestines were infested with worms, some as long as 27 centimeters. Lee had never seen such a severe parasitic infection in a soldier. It indicated malnutrition, poor sanitation, contaminated food. This was a member of the elite Korean People's Army, someone stationed at the most sensitive border post, supposedly among the best-fed and healthiest soldiers in North Korea. If his condition was this poor, what did that reveal about conditions for average soldiers and civilians? Oh underwent emergency surgery that lasted 5 hours. Surgeons removed the bullets, repaired the damaged organs, and extracted the parasites. He required multiple blood transfusions. For days he remained in critical condition, hovering between life and death. His survival, the doctors later said, was miraculous. If the rescue had taken even 15 more minutes, he would have bled to death. As Oh recovered in the hospital, protected by South Korean security forces and under constant medical supervision, the world learned fragments of his story. He was from a relatively privileged background. His father was a general in the North Korean military. He had grown up with more material comfort than most North Koreans experienced. He had been selected for the prestigious posting at the Joint Security Area. By North Korean standards, he was among the fortunate. Yet he had risked death to escape. When Oh finally regained consciousness and was able to speak, he told doctors that he wanted to watch movies and listen to music. These simple pleasures, denied to most North Koreans, were his first requests after surviving gunshot wounds and major surgery. The doctors brought him a tablet computer loaded with South Korean films and K-pop music videos. Oh watched in fascination. He had spent his entire life in a country where access to foreign media was criminal, where television and radio were controlled by the state, where entertainment consisted of propaganda glorifying the Kim family and demonizing external enemies. Now he could watch anything he wanted. The freedom was intoxicating. As O's physical recovery progressed, he began the much harder psychological adjustment to life in South Korea. He was debriefed by intelligence officials who wanted to understand conditions inside North Korea and his reasons for defecting. He was assigned counselors to help him process the trauma of his escape and adjust to an entirely different society. He was enrolled in Hanawon, the resettlement facility where all North Korean defectors spend 12 weeks learning about South Korean culture, economics, language, and daily life. One of the first things that overwhelmed Oh was the lights. When he was first brought to the hospital in the outskirts of Seoul, even in his semi-conscious state, he noticed the brightness. The hospital itself was illuminated. Every floor, every room, lights everywhere. Outside the windows, the city glowed. Streetlights lined every road. Buildings were lit up at night. Neon signs advertised businesses. Traffic lights controlled intersections. Cars had headlights that illuminated the roads. The entire landscape was bathed in light. Oh had grown up in a North Korea that was dark. Electricity was rationed throughout the country. Even in Pyongyang, the capital and most privileged city, power was only available for a few hours each day. In rural areas, electricity might be available once every few days, or once a week, or not at all. At night, North Korea was plunged into darkness. People could not read, could not watch television, could not work. They went to bed when the sun set because there was no light. The entire country shut down after dark. Oh had seen satellite images of the Korean peninsula at night as part of his military training. North Korean propaganda used these images to claim that South Korea was wasteful and decadent, that the lights represented capitalist excess and American imperialism. The propaganda said that North Korea's darkness was virtuous, a sign of energy conservation and rejection of Western materialism. Oh had been taught that South Korea was poor, that ordinary people suffered under American occupation, that only the elite enjoyed material comfort while workers were exploited. But now, looking out the hospital window at Seoul glowing in the distance, Oh understood that the propaganda was lies. The lights were not excess, they were normalcy. They represented a functioning electrical grid, reliable power generation, an economy that could provide electricity to every home and business. The lights meant that people could work after dark, that children could study at night, that families could watch television and cook dinner and live normal lives without being constrained by sunset. When Oh was well enough to leave the hospital and begin moving around Seoul, the contrast with North Korea became even more overwhelming. Seoul was a city of 10 million people, one of the largest and most developed cities in the world. Skyscrapers dominated the skyline. Subway trains ran underground, clean and punctual, carrying millions of passengers each day. Roads were paved and well-maintained, filled with cars that ordinary people owned. Shopping districts stretched for blocks, stores selling everything imaginable. Restaurants served food from around the world. People walked the streets wearing fashionable clothing, talking on smartphones, living lives that seemed impossible by North Korean standards. Oh could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught. North Korean propaganda insisted that South Korea was poor, that American military occupation had impoverished the country, that workers lived in misery while a small elite hoarded wealth. But Oh could see with his own eyes that ordinary South Koreans lived better than North Korean generals. Working-class people had cars, apartments with reliable electricity and running water, smartphones with internet access. They ate meat regularly, not as a rare luxury, but as a normal part of their diet. They traveled freely within Korea and internationally without requiring government permission. They could change jobs, start businesses, move to different cities. They had freedoms that Oh had never imagined were possible. The economic disparity was staggering. South Korea's GDP per capita was roughly 40 times higher than North Korea's. The average South Korean earned more in a month than the average North Korean earned in a year. But the statistics did not fully capture the lived difference. In North Korea, chronic shortages meant that even having money often was not enough to buy what you needed. Goods simply were not available. Rationing systems controlled distribution of food and basic necessities. Black markets existed but operated illegally and at great risk. In South Korea, stores were full of goods. Supermarkets offered dozens of varieties of every product. Electronic stores displayed the latest technology. Clothing stores had styles for every taste and budget. Bookstores sold uncensored books on any topic. The abundance was casual and taken for granted by South Koreans who had never known anything else. But for Oh, who had grown up with chronic scarcity, the abundance was almost incomprehensible. He learned that South Korea had been desperately poor in the 1950s, even poorer than North Korea in the immediate aftermath of the Korean War. But in the decades that followed, South Korea had experienced one of the most dramatic economic transformations in human history. Through industrial development, export-oriented growth, investment in education, and integration into the global economy, South Korea had become one of the world's wealthiest nations. North Korea, by contrast, had stagnated and then collapsed economically. The 1990s famine had killed hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. The economy had never recovered. North Korea in 2017 was poorer than it had been in 1990. Oh asked his counselors and teachers at Hanawan why this had happened. How had two countries, with the same history, the same language, the same culture, diverged so dramatically? The answers involved complex economic and political factors. South Korea had embraced market economics, private property, international trade, and eventually democracy. North Korea had pursued centralized planning, state ownership, economic isolation, and hereditary dictatorship. The systems had produced radically different outcomes. But for Oh, the clearest evidence of systemic failure was the darkness. North Korea at night was black. South Korea at night glowed like daylight. The satellite images that North Korean propaganda tried to spin as evidence of South Korean decadence were actually evidence of North Korean failure. A country that could not provide electricity to its citizens had failed at one of the most basic measures of development. The lights visible from space were not wasteful excess. They were proof that a system worked, that an economy functioned, that people had access to the energy necessary for modern life. Oh thought about his life in North Korea. He had been born in 1992 or 1993 during the worst years of the famine that North Koreans called the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands of people had starved to death. The government ration system had collapsed. Even in Pyongyang, people went hungry. Oh's family, with its military connections, had been relatively protected. But he remembered hunger from childhood, remembered his mother struggling to find food, remembered classmates who simply stopped coming to school because they had starved, or their families had fled, searching for food in the countryside. He had joined the military at 18, as all North Korean men were required to do. Military service was 10 years, an enormous portion of a young man's life. The military was supposed to be better fed than civilians, and in some ways it was. Soldiers received rations that civilians could not access, but the rations were never enough. Official allocations were supposed to be 600 grams of food per day, but in practice, soldiers often received much less. The food was poor quality, usually just rice or corn, sometimes moldy or contaminated. Protein was rare. Fresh vegetables were scarce. Soldiers were chronically hungry, always looking for ways to supplement their rations. The parasitic infection that had shocked the South Korean doctors was not unusual by North Korean standards. Contaminated food and water combined with poor sanitation and no access to antiparasitic medication meant that intestinal parasites were endemic. Most North Koreans had them. People just lived with the constant discomfort, the malnutrition caused by worms consuming nutrients, the health complications that resulted. There was no treatment available. Oh had known he had parasites but had no way to address the problem. It was simply a normal condition of life in North Korea. He thought about the lies he had been taught. North Korean education emphasized that the country was a socialist paradise, that people were happy, that the system took care of everyone. Propaganda claimed that South Korea was hell on earth, occupied by American imperialists, with workers exploited and starving. Oh had been taught that North Koreans were the luckiest people in the world, that they should be grateful to the great leader Kim Il-sung and his descendants for protecting them from capitalist exploitation. But Oh had seen the reality. He had seen people starving. He had seen children begging for food. He had seen public executions of people caught trying to escape to China. He had seen corruption throughout the system, officials hoarding resources while ordinary people suffered. He had seen the fear that permeated society, the constant surveillance, the impossibility of speaking freely about any topic that might be considered politically sensitive. He had lived in a society where 3 generations of a family could be punished for one person's crime, where Songbun, the hereditary caste system, determined life opportunities, where the slightest suspicion of disloyalty could result in being sent to a prison camp from which almost no one returned. And now, recovering in a South Korean hospital, looking out at the lights of Seoul, Oh understood that everything he had been taught was lies. South Korea was not hell. It was prosperous, free, developed. North Korea was not paradise. It was a prison where 25 million people were held hostage by a hereditary dictatorship that maintained power through violence and lies. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Oh had spent his entire life believing certain things about the world. He had believed that his country, despite its hardships, was morally superior to the corrupt capitalist South. He had believed that the Kim family genuinely cared about the Korean people and was protecting them from external enemies. He had believed that the system, while imperfect, was working toward a better future. All of these beliefs collapsed when confronted with the reality of South Korea. The collapse of his worldview left Oh disoriented and traumatized. He experienced depression, anxiety, difficulty sleeping. These psychological reactions were common among North Korean defectors. The adjustment to South Korean society was immensely difficult, not just because of practical challenges like learning new technology or finding employment, but because of the fundamental disorientation of discovering that everything you believed was false. Oh also experienced guilt. He had left North Korea, but his family remained. North Korean authorities typically punished defectors' families through imprisonment, forced relocation, or denial of opportunities. Oh's father, as a military general, might face particularly severe consequences. Oh had no way of knowing what had happened to his parents and siblings after his defection. He could not contact them. He would likely never see them again. The pain of that separation was immense. When Oh gave his first media interview a year after his defection in November 2018, he spoke carefully about his reasons for leaving. He said he had become disillusioned with the system, that he had wanted freedom, that seeing South Korea had shown him a different way of life was possible. He expressed gratitude to the South Korean and American soldiers who had saved his life, and to the doctors who had treated him. He said his survival was a miracle, but he did not criticize North Korea harshly or provide detailed information about conditions there. Part of this restraint was likely to protect his family. Harsh public statements by defectors typically resulted in increased punishment for family members left behind. But in private conversations with counselors and other defectors, Oh spoke more openly about what had driven him to defect. It was not a single factor, but an accumulation of observations. It was the hunger that never went away despite working hard and following all the rules. It was the darkness at night when electricity was unavailable. It was the propaganda that insisted they were living in paradise when obvious evidence suggested otherwise. It was the fear of punishment for any deviation from expected behavior. It was the complete lack of freedom to make choices about his own life. It was the understanding that nothing would ever change, that North Korea would be the same in 20 years, that his entire life would be spent in service to a system that gave nothing back. The decision to defect had crystallized during O's posting at the Joint Security Area. The JSA was unique because North and South Korean soldiers stood face to face, separated only by a low concrete curb that marked the border. O could see South Korean soldiers, well-fed, well-equipped, confident. He could see American soldiers in their modern uniforms with advanced equipment. On the South Korean side of the border were buildings that were clearly well-maintained and prosperous. Just beyond the immediate GSA area was South Korean territory where he could see development, activity, signs of economic life. The contrast with the North Korean side was stark. North Korean buildings in the JSA were shabby and poorly maintained. The North Korean soldiers were thinner, their equipment older, their demeanor more rigid and fearful. Beyond the immediate JSA area, North Korean territory was visibly poorer, with fewer buildings, less activity, less development. O had also heard things through the grapevine. Soldiers talked in whispers about the world outside North Korea. Some had relatives in China who sent information back through smuggled letters or phone calls. Others had seen foreign movies on USB drives that were smuggled into the country and copied and distributed illegally. These glimpses of the outside world were fragmentary and risky. Being caught with foreign media could result in imprisonment or worse. But they circulated anyway, providing North Koreans with information that contradicted official propaganda. O had seen a South Korean film, smuggled into North Korea on a USB drive that was passed from the soldier to soldier. The film was not even particularly focused on wealth or development. It was a romantic comedy, a simple story about young people in Seoul navigating relationships and careers. But what had shocked O was the background. The characters lived in apartments that had electricity all the time. They owned cars. They used smartphones. They ate at restaurants casually. They traveled to other countries for vacation. The wealth that the characters took completely for granted was beyond anything O had ever experienced. North Korean propaganda would have dismissed the film as fiction, as propaganda designed to make capitalism appear attractive. But O understood that even propaganda needed to be somewhat believable to its audience. South Korean filmmakers were not making films for North Korean audiences. They were making films for South Koreans, showing lives that South Korean audiences would recognize as realistic. The casual wealth depicted in the film was not propaganda. It was just how ordinary South Koreans lived. That realization had shaken O deeply. If ordinary South Koreans lived like that, if they had so much material comfort and freedom, then what did that mean about North Korea? It meant that the system had failed, that the promises were lies, that decades of sacrifice had produced nothing but poverty and repression. It meant that he was spending his youth serving a system that could never deliver what it promised, that would keep him and everyone he knew trapped in poverty and darkness for their entire lives. The decision to defect was also practical. O was 24 years old in 2017, coming to the end of his 10-year military service. When soldiers finished their service, they were assigned to civilian work units, usually in agriculture or construction. O faced years of hard labor for minimal compensation, living in dormant conditions under constant surveillance. If he married and had children, they would face the same future. The cycle would continue generation after generation, each one enduring the same hardships, the same hunger, the same fear. O decided he could not accept that future. He would take the extraordinary risk of defecting. The JSA was one of the most dangerous places to cross because it was so heavily monitored and because North Korean soldiers there were selected for loyalty and armed to prevent defections. But O had access. He was assigned there. He could drive a vehicle close to the border. If he moved fast and surprised everyone, he might make it across before being shot. The odds were poor. Most likely he would be killed. But death seemed preferable to the life that awaited him in North Korea. On November 13th, after a night of drinking with his judgment perhaps impaired, but his determination clear, O made his move. He drove his vehicle at high speed toward the border, crashed through barriers, crossed into South Korean territory. He was shot multiple times. He nearly died. But he survived. And in surviving, he entered a new world that was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. The abundance of South Korea was wonderful. The food, the electricity, the technology, the freedom to move and speak and choose. Oh could eat until he was full. He could turn on lights whenever he wanted. He could watch any movie or listen to any music. He could walk the streets without fear of arbitrary arrest. These simple pleasures, which South Koreans took for granted, were revelations to someone who had never experienced them. But the abundance was also terrifying. Oh did not know how to navigate South Korean society. He did not understand how banks worked, how to use public transportation, how to apply for jobs, how to interact with people in this radically different culture. He spoke Korean, but his accent immediately marked him as North Korean, which often resulted in discrimination. Many South Koreans viewed defectors with suspicion or condescension, seeing them as poor and backwards, people to be pitied rather than respected as equals. Oh struggled with technology. He had never used a smartphone before arriving in South Korea. The internet was completely new to him. He had to learn how to search for information, how to use apps, how to navigate online. South Korean children learned these skills growing up, but Oh was learning them as an adult, which was humbling and frustrating. He struggled with consumer choice. In North Korea, scarcity meant you took whatever was available. In South Korea, abundance meant you had to choose among dozens of options for even simple purchases. Oh found this overwhelming. Going to a supermarket, seeing 20 varieties of toothpaste or 30 types of instant noodles, he did not know how to make decisions. The abundance he had longed for became paralyzing when actually confronted with it. He struggled with loneliness. He had left behind everyone he knew. His family was in North Korea and he would never see them again. Other North Korean defectors could understand his experience, but there were deep divides even within the defector community. Those who had left in the 1990s during the famine had different experiences from those who left more recently. Those from Pyongyang had different backgrounds from those from rural areas. Oh sometimes felt isolated even among people who shared his general experience of defection. But despite all the difficulties, Oh never regretted his decision. When asked in interviews whether he would do it again knowing what he knows now, he always said yes. The challenges of adjusting to South Korea were real and substantial, but they were nothing compared to the hopelessness of life in North Korea. In South Korea, Oh had freedom. He had opportunity. He had hope that his life could improve through his own efforts. He had access to food, electricity, information, entertainment. He could make choices about his future rather than having every aspect of his life dictated by the state. Most importantly, he had learned the truth. The lights he saw at night in Seoul were not decadent excess, they were normalcy. They were what life looked like when a system actually worked, when an economy actually functioned, when a government actually served its people rather than just extracting resources and obedience from them. The darkness of North Korea, which propaganda claimed was virtuous energy conservation, was actually evidence of systemic failure. A country that could not keep the lights on had failed its people at the most basic level. Oh became one of approximately 33,000 North Korean defectors living in South Korea as of 2017. Each had their own story, their own reasons for leaving, their own struggles adjusting to life in the South, but they shared common experiences of discovering that everything they had been taught was lies, of recognizing that South Korea was not the enemy, but actually represented what North Korea could have become if it had chosen different policies, of understanding that they had spent their lives serving a system that had betrayed them. Oh's defection had been particularly dramatic because of the video footage. Infrared security cameras in the JSA had captured the entire event, showing Oh's vehicle racing toward the border, North Korean soldiers firing at him, Oh running after his vehicle crashed, falling wounded, and South Korean soldiers eventually rescuing him. The South Korean military released the footage publicly and it went viral internationally. People around the world watched a young man risk his life to escape from North Korea, watched him get shot and nearly die in the pursuit of freedom. The footage served South Korean propaganda purposes, providing dramatic evidence of the desperation of life in North Korea. But it also served a deeper purpose. It showed the world what the North Korean government tried to hide, which was that people would rather die than continue living under the regime, that the propaganda about socialist paradise was lies, that the system maintained itself through violence and fear rather than through popular support. North Korea never officially responded to Oh's defection. The government typically ignored defections in public, not wanting to draw attention to the fact that people were leaving. But internally, there were consequences. Security was increased at the JSA. Soldiers assigned there underwent additional political indoctrination. The officers responsible for monitoring personnel at the JSA faced punishment for failing to prevent Oh's escape. And Oh's family, back in North Korea, faced consequences that Oh could only imagine but not prevent. Several years after his defection, Oh was still adjusting to life in South Korea. He had learned to use smartphones and navigate the internet. He had found work and was supporting himself. He had friends among other defectors and some South Koreans who did not judge him for his background. He watched movies and listened to music freely, the simple pleasures he had requested immediately after waking from surgery. He ate enough food every day, not gourmet meals but consistent nutrition that kept him healthy. And every night when he looked out his window at the lights of Seoul, he understood that he had made the right decision. The lights represented everything North Korean propaganda said South Korea was not. They represented prosperity, development, functionality, normalcy. They represented a system that worked, that provided for its people, that generated enough electricity to keep the lights on at night. The lights were not excessive, they were basic. They were what 21st century life looked like in a country that actually functioned. Oh knew that people in North Korea, looking at satellite images or propaganda leaflets or smuggled information about the South, did not always believe what they saw. The propaganda was so comprehensive, the indoctrination so intensive, that many North Koreans genuinely believed South Korea was poor and that they were better off under the Kim regime. Oh had believed these things himself until seeing the evidence with his own eyes, but for those North Koreans who had glimpses of the truth, who had seen foreign films or heard stories from Chinese traders or received information from relatives outside the country, the lights visible from satellite images told a story that no propaganda could counter. They showed that North Korea was dark while South Korea glowed. They showed which system had failed and which had succeeded. They showed where prosperity existed and where poverty reigned. The lights did not lie. Oh sometimes wondered whether Korea would ever be reunified, whether the border that divided the peninsula would someday be erased, whether North Koreans could someday live with the same freedom and prosperity that South Koreans enjoyed. The obstacles were immense. The economic gap was enormous. The psychological indoctrination of generations would take decades to overcome. The political obstacles seemed insurmountable. But Oh hoped that someday, somehow, the border would come down and all Koreans could live in the light. Until then, he would live his life in the South, grateful for the freedom he had gained and mourning the family he had lost. He would tell his story to those willing to listen, providing testimony about conditions in North Korea and the courage required to escape. He would work to build a life that justified the enormous risk he had taken. And every night he would look at the lights of Seoul and remember that he had crossed from darkness into light, from oppression into freedom, from lies into truth. The journey had nearly killed him, but he had survived, and he was home.